The other thing I'd like to mention, I'm over nearly at my half up, I'm afraid, but keep going.
Yes.
The other thing I'd like to mention is the sort of support that the air section at DCNCS and these intercept stations at places like Cheadle and Kingstown, the help they gave to RAF Bomber Command and the US 8th Air Force. These were the two Allied commands that were active virtually every day, in the RAF case, throughout the war. In the American case, second half of it. Every day that flying was possible, they conducted operations against Germany and German targets in other parts of Europe. The army is the force that was involved primarily in the invasion of Europe, absolutely the main event in the war. But it wasn't every day. The RAF had to have this information day after night, day after day. And the intercept stations, these two I keep mentioning, were providing just that day after day. Well, now, in the case of Bomber Command, who operated at night only, they had discovered that German fighter defences in daytime were too superior. It was no good attempting day raids out of range of fighter support. And that only meant going a little way into Europe. You couldn't attack targets in Germany in daylight. So they didn't do it. They did night attacks. And nevertheless, they weren't being very successful in terms of doing these raids without grievous losses. The Germans had developed a system of night fighter defences where roughly what they were doing was they could control individual German night fighters by getting them to circle around a radio beacon and then control them in detail by means of using a short-range radar device. Very successful. And Bomber Command's tactics in those days was to fly in straight lines to targets in a big mass of spaced out mass of aircraft, which meant that the aircraft arrived at the German defences in ones and twos and were absolutely slaughtered by these night fighter defences. Well, from the interception of German night fighter radio telephony, it was possible to see how this came about, how the German system worked. And when we were we began producing at Bletchley after the event studies of all this stuff, which enabled one to work out how the system functioned. We proposed to the air industry that we should produce reports on this so that Bomber Command could become aware of the fact that why they were losing so grievously. But the Air Ministry refused us permission at Bletchley to report this information and maintained that ban for 2 years, first half of the war. The basis on which they insisted on this was it wasn't our job to produce intelligence. Our job was just to break ciphers. We were producing intelligence from plain language. They wouldn't let us report it. I think in the end, that when they did give way, this was because the American Air Force had arrived in Europe and wasn't subject to theories like that by the Air Ministry. The Americans said, we want this information, and they got it. And so did the RAF at the same time, which was good. But the Air Ministry never really accepted that we should be doing this. Having denied it, prevented us from doing this for 2 years, they then were extremely, they wouldn't let us for almost another year have direct dealings with the intelligence officers at Bomber Command and at the US Air Force. And it was only when we were able to go as individuals who knew about what the stuff meant and talked to the intelligence officers at the commands that this material was really used to good purpose. In the Bomb Command case, I can give you shortly a description of the sort of thing that happened. I'm perhaps glamorizing it a bit, but however, this sort of thing did happen. When we were allowed to send our reports to Bomber Command changed their tactics. Instead of just flying straight lines at a target, which a town or whatever, factory, which enabled the Germans to plan their defences on the night. Bomber Command began to go roundabout routes with the dog legs. In other words, they'd set off in that direction and then change like that, so the Germans couldn't predict. The Bomber Command also began to use radio countermeasures. Well, now that was partly, they hadn't been able to do that before because the radio countermeasures didn't exist. But fortunately, they did exist by the time Bomber Command was prepared to use sensible tactics. And the first result of this, that the chain of night fighter defences, which had been done so much damage to Bomber Command, became useless because the bombers now not only were taking circuitous routes, but they flew in as close formation as it was possible, not really close, at night time. So a continuous stream of bombers arrived at these defences and they just couldn't cope. They had been able to cope with aircraft spaced out, they could deal them one at a time. So they were out of action. The Germans had to overnight alter their tactics. So instead of controlling individual night fighters against individual bombers, they now controlled whole formations of night fighters, squadrons of them, at one go, to attack these closer formation. But there was possible a countermeasure against that. And it wasn't GCHQ that devised DCNCS that devised the countermeasure, that was the RAF. But we supplied them with the information which enabled them to use the countermeasures. And one obvious countermeasure was to transmit bogus instructions to the German night fighters. There was a very powerful transmitter on the southeast coast of England, and this was used to send false orders to the German night fighters, telling them to fly in different directions or go back to base, that kind of thing. And so that the German language used in these false orders would appear to be proper German. The operators from Kingsdown, radio telephony operators, spoke the orders to the Germans. And the Germans tried all sorts of ways to counter this. One way was to get the main forces broadcast system, German forces broadcast system, radio broadcast system, to transmit orders to the German night fighters. But that didn't succeed. Another thing they attempted was to give orders, only in the broadest sense, by playing particular tunes, popular tunes. A particular tune would mean Fly North or whatever. That of course didn't work either. So for a time the German night fighters force was almost useless. They did of course recover to a degree, and losses became serious again, but it varied from night to night, instead of being almost entirely in favour of the German night fighter defences. So that was an important help to Bomber Command. The Americans, of course, arrived late in one sense, and had no SIGINT, this is the word, this sort of intelligence, resources of their own. So they depended, while they were in Europe, entirely on places like Cheadle and Kingsdown, the RAF intercept stations, and the air section in DC and CS to provide them with this intelligence. And they became our best customers, as it happens. They just took to the idea of collaborating with a group of young men and women, civilians, who had intelligence they needed. They didn't have the RAF reaction of, you know, these are not people, they couldn't possibly, they haven't the experience to know about all this. Nobody had it until they learnt it during the war. And one thing that happened, and I think this is perhaps the most highly developed bit of air intelligence, air tactical intelligence during the war, the Germans had begun to change the equipment they use for transmitting all this radio telephony, which was so important, to a different wavelength, a different frequency, which couldn't be intercepted properly at these fixed stations in England. It was shorter range, it was more within range, and they were within range of themselves, so to speak. It was a more efficient way of transmitting orders, but we couldn't hear it properly at these stations in Britain. And the air section suggested to the Air Force that the thing to do was to put radio RT operators into bomber aircraft and fly them at the times of the bomber command raid. They would be able to hear very effectively, just as easily as the Germans themselves, this important traffic. And the Americans went for this wholeheartedly, and long before the end of the war, every main raid that they did on German targets would carry an American, German-speaking linguist radio operator. He would sit in the aircraft of the formation leader, and when he began to hear the radio signals of a German night fighter force, he could warn his commander, his aircraft, that Germans were coming, the direction from which they would be coming, and the height at which they would be flying. And this was of great importance to the Americans, who were operating in daylight and needed the maximum warning of attacks on their bomber formation. They had eventually had escorting fighters with them, and these could respond to this information. And in fact, they achieved air superiority against the German day fighters as far away as eastern Germany, made with aircraft. I can't remember the name, but there was a particular long-range fighter which was a tremendous asset to the Americans. And I think that use of intelligence was probably as advanced development as one would have found in World War II on the air intelligence side. Well, I've exceeded my lecture, I've waffled away. I would be happy to try to answer any questions that anybody has.